Hello, and thank you for joining us. It is my honor to welcome you to our conversation tonight entitled A Time to Build, Strengthening American Democracy. This session is part of a 2-week symposium on Judaism, citizenship, and democracy presented by the Shalom Hartman Institute. We are grateful to our organizational partner this evening, the National Museum of American Jewish History. The Hartman Institute is a pluralistic think tank, an educational center for the Jewish people. And we invite you to find out more about us and see more videos, articles, podcasts at shalomhartman.org. My name is Rebecca Starr, and I am the Midwest Director for the Shalom Hartman Institute, coming to you from my home in the metropolitan Detroit area. It's my pleasure to help facilitate this session behind the scenes, along with my colleague, Sam Heinbach. And now I am honored to introduce this evening's presenters. Dr. Rivka Schwartz is a research fellow of the Kogod Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. She spent more than 15 years in the field of Jewish secondary and post-secondary education. Rivka currently serves as Associate Principal of General Studies at SAR High School in the Bronx, New York, and she earned a PhD in History of Science from Princeton University. Yuval Levin is the founding and current editor of National Affairs. He's also the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a senior editor of The New Atlantis and a contributing editor to National Review. He's been a member of the White House Domestic Policy Staff under President George W. Bush, executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics, and a congressional staffer at the member, committee, and leadership levels. You can read more about Rivka and Yuval by reading their bios linked at the bottom of the session webpage. And now we're ready to begin our learning, and I'm going to hand it over to Rivka and Yuval to begin the conversation.
Good evening, and thank you so much. It's an honor to be here and to have the opportunity tonight to engage Yuval in conversation about his interesting, important, and thought-provoking book. We're going to talk today a little bit about the state of American democracy and society and what we're up to, where we are and where we might need to go from here. This is not the place to come to find out information about early voter returns from 18 to 29-year-olds in North Carolina. There are plenty of other people who are looking to provide that to you tonight. Instead, we want to look at the bigger picture of where we are, again, where we need to be and how we might get there. And tonight's conversation is going to focus on Yuval's book, A Time to Build, From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, Now Recommitting, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revive the American Dream. So it is a commonplace, and indeed Yuval refers to it in his book, to say that trust in American institutions has declined, as measured by Gallup polls looking at trust in all sorts of institutions, political, but not only, religious, the press, the professions, all across the board. And there are many ways we could approach that or get into that, but I actually want to pick one which is political and therefore timely, and ask you, Yuval, both what it says about politicians, that they like to cast themselves as outsiders, as people coming not from within political systems or institutions, but as people who stand outside them. Even the person who currently occupies the Oval Office is running for re-election against his opponent's 47 years in Washington. So that's a question about what it says about the candidates and what it says about the American voters, that this has appeal when presumably to have our auto mechanic tell us he had never fixed a car before, or our cardiac surgeon tell us that she had never repaired a heart before, would not recommend them to us in the performance of their profession. Why, when it comes to a politician, does being an outsider seem to be some sort of credential?
Well, thank you, Rivka. It's a great question, and thank you in general for this opportunity, and thanks to the Hartman Institute for hosting. The question you ask gets at what is really, I think, a key challenge for anybody thinking about the revitalization of American institutions and the revival of American trust in them. We're at a moment of enormous frustration with the core institutions of our society, from civic and communal all the way up to those of national politics. People feel like our institutions are not serving them, are not there for them. And part of what that ends up meaning is that we try to understand ourselves and to present ourselves as outsiders, not as shaped by these institutions, not as somehow molded by their ideas of what we ought to be, but as standing outside them as critics, as mavericks. It's an especially powerful idea in politics, as you suggest. And even in some quite ridiculous ways, where, like you say, the incumbent president runs as an outsider. There's no more insider than the president of the United States, and yet even he feels the need to run as though he is outside the system, and to accuse his opponent of being the insider, having spent half a century in politics. In some ways, there's nothing new here. The appeal of the maverick has always been very strong in American politics. And people have always tried to run as the person pushing the system from the outside. But I do think there is something new to the intensity with which politicians do that and with which the public wants that. The frustration we have with our institutions is such that we think what we need is to take them off of us, to somehow relieve the burdens they impose on us, to be liberated from them, rather than to understand ourselves through them and to meet our needs through them. What I talk about in the book is a kind of outsiderism, the appeal of the person without institutional connections, the independent, the nonpartisan, which in a lot of ways also says the non-professional, the inexperienced. These are ways of saying the same thing, and yet the appeal that it has in our politics right now suggests that we think of institutions as imposing burdens and as sources of corruption. And in order to understand why we need functional institutions, why just throwing away the ones we have isn't going to work, that at the end of the day, we need to think about how to build new structures or rebuild old ones that can serve us well, requires us to think about what institutions are and what they do. And that's a challenge in American life. We like to hide these things from ourselves and to imagine that we don't need institutions, that we are all independent, and that ultimately we are as free as humanly possible. And so to surface some of the underlying needs that are served and met by core institutions is part of the reason for the book and its argument.
One of the things that you say is that our sense of things being as bad as we experience them to be right now is not because things are in fact worse than they ever were, but because the institutions are so weak that they are failing to meet a time, even if it's not a particularly awful time. I have to say that as somebody who teaches history, I was happy to see that, because when you listen to people saying our politics are more bitter than they ever were, one does feel,
Let me introduce you to the Civil War, right?
There were 750,000 Americans dead at other Americans' hands. That was probably worse than things are now. But the sense that our institutions are failing us and our institutions are falling down and decaying may be why, even if things are not worse in some absolute sense, we experience them as being worse. Sorry.
Please. No, go ahead.
Before we go on to talk a little bit about what the institutions aren't doing or need to be doing, and then eventually to get to how can we rebuild the institutions, the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America is a pluralistic Jewish institution. And although most of what we're going to talk about tonight is more broadly political, I actually was struck by something deeply Jewish about the idea that it is by being bound in a structure and operating within a framework that we are the most free. And you talk about people rejecting these institutions because they want to float freely and most be themselves and be most authentic and be most independent. And you argue that, in fact, the way we can most fully realize ourselves and most fully develop our society, both, is with the structuring and the grounding and the forming that institutions give us. And it struck me that's actually a very Jewish idea.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's an idea that points to a distinction in our politics that lies beneath a lot of our disagreements, where I think that there's one way of thinking about what freedom is that just says freedom is liberation from constraint. It's being left alone to make your own choices. That's when you're free. There's another way of thinking about it that says that we start out not really ready for that kind of freedom. We start out in the world needing to be formed before we're ready to be free. And that ultimately a sustainable freedom also requires a kind of responsibility. And that this formation is what our institutions are for, from the family and the school and the community all the way up to the political and social institutions that span our entire society. Their purpose is to form us. And if we see ourselves as needing formation, then we see ourselves as needing these institutions. And I do think that ultimately true freedom is only made possible by that kind of formation. And certainly it's an idea with very deep roots in Judaism, the notion that the constraints of the law are the ways we can be free. And that really, in some ways, you might say, closing the distance between what we want and what we ought to want is how we become free, is an idea with very deep roots, not only Jewish roots maybe, but certainly for me, they're Jewish roots.
Something else that I want to say here about perhaps the Jewish community as a community, less as a system and a set of ideas. But I think that those of us who have experienced in one way or another the benefits that have been conferred by strong institutions, whatever those institutions are, whether they are religious, familial, the military, or those of us who have experienced, again, strong institutions, as you say, as molding and shaping forces in our own lives, I think probably have more of a sense of the value of those institutions and the need to maintain and pass them on. And as increasing numbers of Americans don't have that experience, to even try to convince them of the value of being formed by institutions in this way itself is a sales job that one has to do in a way that some of us know it instinctively.
I think that's very true. And it points to just a tragic fact about our situation, which is that it becomes harder to make the case for this way of thinking about our society the more we find that people are failing to receive the benefits of our institutions. The more our institutions fail, the harder it is to see why we need them. The trouble is we do need them. The argument for institutions is not just that they're great, it's that we can't do without them. And it's especially people who are most vulnerable. And so you might say people who have been most disserved by our institutions, the people without money and power and privilege in our society who most need functional institutions. People with that power and money and privilege will be fine, whatever happens. But people who need to have their rights protected, or who need some help rising in our society, or some protection from others who are more powerful than them, they're the ones who really need institutions to function. And yet at this moment in the life of our society, they're the ones who are least likely to see that they require that, and really to see what it would mean for an institution to serve that purpose in their lives. And, you know, some of the way to fill that need and help them see that is to provide them with this kind of help, to help them see what functional institutions can do. But I think there's also room for making this kind of argument, for a kind of education in how our social fabric is kept together. And it's an enormous challenge. The fraying of that fabric is why we find ourselves in this situation. The frustration people feel doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not, it didn't fall out of the sky. It's a function of institutional failures. It's a function of the fact that people aren't simply wrong to think that a lot of the core institutions of our society are not serving them well now. But the solution to that can't be to burn those down or throw them out or drain the swamp or whatever you want to say. The solution has to be to build functional institutions that do help our society function and hold it together. And that's no easy thing in the circumstances we're facing.
I want to come back in a couple of minutes to the conversation about not burning down the institutions or throwing them out. But first, I want to sit for a little bit with the question of institutional failure, because we do broadly see elite institutions that have shown themselves not to have met the responsibility to the people to whom they are supposed to be responsible. And you identify particularly that institutions are seen as failing when they don't live up to their own internal ethos as an institution. Yeah. So if the medical profession is supposed to take care of those and instead who are sick, and instead turns out to be following a profit motive, it has failed to uphold its own ethos. And if the legal profession, rather than seeking justice, et cetera. And so it's really not just about some general sense of failure, but about the specific sense of failing to uphold that which is supposed to be their core value system that has them broadly seen as failing. And I want to ask you why you think that is, why you think we're seeing more of that in American life.
Yeah, you know, one way in which institutions fail that way is a kind of corruption, which you suggest, pointing to the profit motive and related motives that just end up corrupting people's sense of what their purpose is in the world. That's something that's always been with us. It's not an excuse for it happening now, but it doesn't necessarily help us understand the intensity of the public's loss of confidence in institutions today. And one additional form of institutional corruption that I point to in the book as being a little more current or particular to our moment has to do not so much with a profit motive, but with a distinct kind of fame motive, where people come to think of institutions not as molds that shape them, but as platforms to stand on and be seen and heard particularly to be engaged in the political and culture wars that so dominate our public life now. so that people use every institution as if it were just a stage to stand on and show what side you're on. Whether it's a university or a synagogue or a church, whether it's Congress, whether it's a corporation, it's just a place to stand, build a personal brand, build a following, and show what side of the big polarized culture war you're on. And as people do that, it becomes harder to trust the institution that they're part of, because they seem to be using it for their own advantage and promotion, rather than being used by it to advance a shared end, a shared common good. And so there is such a thing, for example, as professional responsibility, being formed by your profession as an institution. There's such a thing in the world as an accountant or a physician, or even a member of Congress. And we can see when people fail to behave in the way that seems to abide by the distinct particular integrity of that kind of profession. And I think very often now we find that people are trying to use the capital built up by their profession to build their own following. Members of Congress now basically, rather than using a microphone to get power and drive change, they seek power to get a microphone and build a following. And they think about Congress as a way to have more social media followers, a better time slot on cable news. They think less in terms of how to legislate, less in terms of how to advance change, and more in terms of how to perform. And that kind of performative aspect of our political life, our cultural life, has taken over a lot of what ought to be institutional life, and makes it very difficult, among other things, for institutions to function and for us to trust them.
That part of the analysis about people using that the mistrust of the institution is born of people using institutions as levers to seek fame or attention doesn't quite seem to me to capture all of the ways in which institutions have failed in the recent past decade, generation, whatever it is. I mean, if we think about the enormous institutional failure of the Catholic Church that was revealed by the sex abuse scandal, that wasn't about people seeking fame. That was about people seeking whatever internal machinations, their own advancement, their professional lives in the church that they were seeking. If I think about a lot of corporate America, then what we're talking about, people's sense that corporate America has failed them, is about skimming profits at the top or making enormous amounts of profits while factories are closed, jobs are lost. You can explain to me lots of things about the complexities of global trade, but in my city, in my town, in my community, which has lost its factory, lost its jobs, while the CEO has his sixth jet, that isn't necessarily about seeking fame, even if the CEO is reclusive and quiet. It's about a certain sense that the values that they are, I don't know what values they're honoring, but they're certainly not values that serve me. And maybe that the values that they profess are not the ones that they're living out. Fame seeking to me doesn't quite seem to capture all of it.
So I think about I talk about the Catholic Church scandal, for example, in the book as an example of insiderism as opposed to outsiderism, which is, again, insiderism meaning a more traditional form of corruption where people use the power of the institution as a mask for their own vices, for their own corruption. And that certainly happens. That has always happened, and it happens now no less than ever. And again, I also think there are ways that profit motives and other motives corrupt people. But I do think that there is a distinct way in which some of the differences between what our institutions are for have come to be clouded in contemporary America. And all these institutions come to be seen as just stages in the culture war. You see that some in corporate America, where companies start to take sides in political disputes. And, I don't care what you think about this or that. I'm just trying to get a chicken sandwich. And the idea that everybody has to always be talking about where they stand on these kinds of culture war issues is one reason. I certainly wouldn't argue that it's the only reason. One reason why it's become harder to take these institutions seriously. And it's also a way in which the institutions of our politics themselves have become harder to trust and to take seriously. So that if everybody's performing, the president of the United States now basically thinks about the presidency as a stage to perform on. He treats himself as a commentator, not as an administrator, less as an executive than as a kind of television personality who has a lot to say, including about government. And he'll complain on Twitter about the Department of Justice. And, we'll sit there thinking, well, they work for you. Maybe you could make a phone call and see if this could work differently. But the idea that everybody in our politics has to feel like they are on the outside offering criticism, and no one wants to feel like this is my responsibility and I should be doing something about it, means that it becomes much harder to trust some of these institutions. It certainly doesn't mean that the more familiar forms of corruption aren't there, but I think it's an additional one that contributes in a particular way to the alienation that people feel from some of the core institutions of our society, and makes it harder for us to sustain solidarity. It would be easier to feel affiliated, connected with something if some of our institutions were simply held in common in the country. They didn't belong to my party or your party or that party or this party, but they served a purpose that helps all of us. And some institutions are really defined by that kind of integrity, and their failure to advance it today is part of the reason the public can't trust them.
Well, certainly watching something like that with the public health community and the CDC, in which something that should have been a common public trust, advancing a common public interest, has become a pawn in political battles in ways which predictably have diminished the public's trust in the things that it's doing and saying. You very interestingly connect this idea of people not being formed by institutions, but almost sort of being branded by them, that going through an institution is a way to amass a certain stamp or credential rather than become a certain kind of person, with the couple of generations old American idea of meritocracy. And so if it's all about amassing the credentials to earn my way into an elite university, then getting into an elite university is not to teach me how to think and become a certain kind of person. It's simply to stamp me that I have arrived. And so you connect this concept of the meritocracy with a change in the way that the institutions function and people come through the institutions, and suggest that we need to wholesale rethink that idea of merit and that way of forming a societal elite.
Yeah, meritocracy is a solution to a real problem. The problem is the sheer fact that the American elite is exclusive, as an elite would be, and is hard to enter, and was particularly hard to enter until the last couple of generations for anyone who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male. The meritocracy has improved things on that front dramatically by making it easier for people to enter our elite institutions, especially through the path, the kind of highway of the elite university, based on other metrics, based on merit that can be demonstrated by standardized testing, by grades, by academic achievement. And I wouldn't suggest that the problem wasn't real or that the solution wasn't effective. The trouble is that solution was effective once, and after that, the meritocracy becomes its own kind of aristocracy, where generation after generation, the people who have made it through are in a position to help their own children make it through. And the measure of merit is a measure of only a particular kind of merit, a kind of technocratic merit, a measure of intelligence, maybe a measure of ability to take these tests. It's not a measure of character. It's not a measure of responsibility. And once you've met that measure, you're in. There's not then a requirement, a limit on what you can do, a sense that the privileges you have are privileges and therefore demand of you certain kinds of obligations and responsibilities in return. And that tends to create a kind of irresponsible elite in various institutions that are fed by these elite universities. And it contributes to this notion that ultimately our institutions are there to display the people in them. They're fundamentally performative. It makes it much harder for us to believe that our elite institutions form people who are worthy of being an elite. Now, there are exceptions to this. If someone tells you they went to Harvard, you might think that could be a smart person, but a smart person because they got into Harvard. If someone tells you they went to the Naval Academy, I think you're likely to think that could be a serious man or woman, a serious person. And not because they got in, but because the Navy makes people more serious. The military is the one great exception to the public's loss of trust in institutions. It's the only institution on the broad measure that Gallup does every year that is more trusted by the public now than it was in 1970. Now, part of that is the military was really not trusted in 1970 in the Vietnam era, but part of it is also that the public's confidence in it as an institution has increased dramatically because people have a sense that the military not only is competent, but is formative, It presents itself to the public as turning men and women into soldiers and Marines and airmen. And that means something. And it means something more than just skills. It means something about character, about integrity. That's the way in which the formative power of an institution can help the public gain some trust in it. And I think that more of our elite institutions, our professions, and corporate America and the academy need to help us see what they require of the people in them, so that we can believe that there's some measure of integrity that's involved in elevating people in these institutions, and not just some kind of one-time measure of competence or intelligence or test taking. It's a challenge. Look, the meritocracy does solve a real problem. And so to say that it too creates problems is not to say that it has to be thrown away. But I think we need to find ways of using institutional obligations to constrain elites in various arenas of American life so that they can be easier to trust.
I thought the most striking example of this, getting into an institution simply as a way of marking who you were with no intention at all of having that shape you in any way, was the Varsity Blues college admission scandal, in which a number of Hollywood actors and various other well-off people were engaging in whatever acts of bribery and fraud to get their kids into college, while the kids were making social media videos declaring their intentions to do nothing in college but go to parties. And so the parents' investment in getting their children into the institution had nothing, it wasn't even about professional, it was about nothing other than getting to say you got the child into an institution and reaping branding benefits from that.
Mm-hmm. And even the parents benefit, right? It sort of builds the family brand that your kid went to or whatever school it was. And, there are ways in which, especially in the age of social media, we think of ourselves, we think of family life, we think of social life in just a bizarrely performative way. We turn ourselves into miniature celebrities, and we treat ourselves as our own paparazzi, kind of hounding ourselves for photographs all the time. And everything we do becomes a kind of performance. Everything we experience, we think, well, how's this going to look later on Facebook? And the change of attitude that involves is a move in the direction of performance that is also encouraged by a lot of our other institutions, and so contributes to this kind of strange corruption of expectations.
You've talked a lot about the people who aren't served well by institutions and the way in which they have justifiably lost trust in institutions. I saw something in your book which actually made me think about a phenomenon in our current politics, about a group of people who might very rightly have lost trust in institutions and yet perhaps still see that as their hope or salvation. I wanted to ask you to speak with that. In your book, you quote Seymour Martin Lipset saying about college protesters in the 1960s or the 1970s, that the difference between the black and white campus protesters was that the white protesters were much more radical and wanted to destroy everything, and that the black campus protesters actually wanted to work within the structures that existed to make things better. And what that brought to mind was Joe Biden's Dead Man Walking primary campaign, right, in which he was coming in laster than last and raising no money, and it looked like they were going to have to turn the lights off. And it was the African-American primary voters in South Carolina who said, please, we'll take a pass on your far more radical candidates who are going to transform American life in whatever fundamental ways and may not even regard themselves as members of the political party that they're asking to lead. And we will take our deeply institutionally embedded, been around forever, old as the dirt, Joe Biden. And so that's an interesting moment at a time of real lack of trust of institutions, of at least one group of Americans with a great deal at stake, saying we actually choose the institutional path rather than the more radical path. And I wonder if you think that says anything more than just what it says.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point, and I think it does. One way to think about that is that people who really do need things to change are more inclined to think about how to build something than just about how to tear something down. They're not just frustrated or unhappy with the system, but they're actually disserved by it and want it to serve them better. And so they incline to think more constructively and more practically. And so rather than just use politics as a way to vent frustration, which is what populism is about, left and right, and so just elect somebody who will blow up the system, or somebody whose purpose is essentially just to shake things up. They're looking for somebody who can also work within that system and drive it towards some particular ends. I think there are ways in which the kind of moral critique that's been offered of our society by Black Americans through our history has had that character to it. Maybe the most extraordinary moment in American life in the 20th century must have been Martin Luther King standing on the Mall in 1963 and saying not to hell with this country, not throw it away, which he would have had a right to say, but saying instead, look at the Declaration of Independence and look how badly you're failing to live up to it. That's a way of speaking to people's better angels. It's a way of speaking to people's capacity to improve. It's a way of trying to draw some good that might help to address the bad. And it's not just a venting of frustration, but it's a way to try to think about how to actually advance change. And I do think something like that happened in this case. The Democratic Party came pretty close to doing what the Republican Party did last time, came pretty close to choosing someone who was essentially an outsider who could only promise to burn things down, but instead chose somebody else. And I do think that suggests an attitude about institutions, an attitude that says that there is some value to being an insider, and to being able to understand the system and work with the system. And so shows a sense of what institutions can accomplish and why they matter that is maybe out of step in our politics now, out of fashion, but much needed.
The other thing, I said we weren't going to predict early voting returns from North Carolina, but maybe this is as close as I'll get, is if the polling is to be believed, there are many fewer voters intending to vote third party in this election cycle, which means the sense, again, that my vote has to be a pure expression of myself rather than a reality of the systems that exist and a way to do the best that I can within the current structures and systems. Perhaps people's choice to do that in the last election cycle has clarified the stakes here, so that this election cycle, they're choosing to cast a vote for one of the two people who can actually occupy the Oval Office for the next 4 years. Before we move on to our last question or two, I would just like to say that we will be taking questions from the audience after that, and participants can submit questions in the Q&A box on the bottom, and we'll be pulling from those in just a few minutes. So I want to turn us now to the question of renewing our institutions. We spent a good deal of time talking about the loss of faith of people in institutions, the ways in which institutions have earned that loss of faith or have failed the people, the ways in which broad trends and developments in American life have contributed to all of that. Where do we go from here? And you say very clearly in your book that where we go is not back. This is not about going back to some imagined perfect past, but it's about some kind of rebuilding. What does that rebuilding look like?
Yeah, so look, I'm a conservative, and so I do believe there's a lot to learn from history and a lot to build on. But I think of conservatism as a mode of progress. It's a different mode than progressivism, but it's a way forward, not a way backward. And it seems to me that in order to recover some capacity for trust in institutions, and more importantly, and primarily to recover the trustworthiness of institutions, we have to think about the ways in which we've lost that trust. And if part of the reason we've lost that trust is that it seems like people don't think about their institutional obligations before they use institutional power, then the way back has to begin really in some ways with each of us asking ourselves in little moments of decision, what institutional obligations we have? What is my role here as a teacher, as a student, as a religious leader or a congregant, as an employer or an employee, as a citizen, a neighbor, a member of Congress, a president? What does my role here mean for what I should be doing in this situation? I think that is a great unasked question in this moment in American life. And the people who really drive us crazy right now are people who don't seem to ask that question when they obviously should. And the people who we respect, who we think are doing their best in this moment, are people who clearly are asking that question. And rather than just saying what they want, doing what they choose, are asking themselves, what's my responsibility here to this distinct group of people, a responsibility somehow shaped by the institutions that we're part of. That question is not a substitute for institutional reform, but I think that it's a prerequisite for it, because to reform any of our institutions, and the book gets into some reforms we could make of Congress and the executive, of universities and other things, but before any of that could happen, people within those institutions have to recognize the nature of the problem and the fact that we, because all of us have a role in some set of institutions, may be part of the problem. And we have to begin by recognizing that we have obligations and responsibilities that are functions of our institutional roles. To recover that, to remember that, I think is the beginning of the process that we have to go through as a country. And that leaves me hopeful, because I think that it's possible to be hopeful about America when you look at it from the bottom up. It's much harder to be hopeful looking at our country from the top down. We need national leadership too. We have to have good national leadership. But the kind of renovation and reformation that we need is not going to start at the top. It's going to reach the top as the result of a broader cultural process that has to begin closer to the level of the interpersonal.
I'll ask maybe one final question following up on that, and then we can move on. Which is to say that a renewal that begins from the bottom, is there actually a role for support from the top for that renewal which begins from the bottom? Is in fact that perhaps necessary? So that one of the institutions that we haven't talked about here, but that you do talk about, is the family. If there are many things contributing to the undermining of the family as an institution in American life, but certainly financial precarity and the difficulty of, the eroding value of the minimum wage and the lack of access to health insurance and all the other, and now certainly in the COVID-induced economic crisis, all the other ways in which these other problems contribute to the precarity and difficulty of family life. Is there in fact a top-down way to provide the substrate on which then the bottom-up renewal can happen?
Yeah, I think that's the right way to think about the role that government can play, that politics can play, which is a supporting role, not a leading role, but a crucial supporting role to help meet needs that now make it difficult for people to take responsibility and to play the roles that are demanded of them in their communities and their families. You can't just expect people to do that when they simply don't have the resources, when they simply don't have the capacity, when they're simply denied the access. And so there is a role for government in helping to provide that kind of capacity, including in supporting families. And we can debate about how that should work, but I think our policy debates need to be about how that should work, the forms of support that might be most effective or best in line with what we think of as best for the family, best for the community. That's the kind of left-right debate that we ought to be having. I think at this moment, it's nearly impossible for us to be having that kind of left-right debate, a traditional policy debate, because our political culture is so dysfunctional that our two parties basically each sees the other as the country's biggest problem. And we treat elections as though the problem to be solved is the existence of the other party. And that means that we're not focused on other problems, practical problems, that have to be addressed before we can really think about how our country can be on a path back to its best self. So absolutely, I think there is a role for our political life and for government, but we have to think of it as a supportive role for the kind of renewal that ultimately can only really begin at the interpersonal level.
I think that if we start to talk about the current, there is a sense in which avoiding talking about the current failures of our national government or the partisan breakdown is avoiding a very important part of this entire conversation. That is Absolutely. Certainly true. I want to name that we're avoiding it. And on the other hand, I think to enter into that is to embark on a whole other conversation, and B, perhaps to recapitulate some of the very unpleasantnesses we're trying to avoid. And so I will, for all of our listeners, acknowledge that there's a lot going unaddressed in that part of the conversation. And nevertheless, there's more than enough to address here. And so we will keep our focus here and leave the discussion of, the who started it and who's more to blame and how are we ever going to get out of our constitutional hardball conversation for another evening or another book discussion. At this point, we're going to turn to some of the questions that we've been fielded from participants. And actually one of them that I want to turn to now addresses what was once a major and important formative institution in American life, which had impacts political, economic, and social, and which has been on the decline for some decades. And one of our participants asks, how do unions and the decline of unions in the last several decades fit into the conversation?
Yeah, I take this up some in the book, and I'm a conservative who thinks that there's a lot of value to unions, and that unions are best understood as civic institutions. American labor unions have become something like national political institutions, and I think they've gone through a transformation that is a lot like what some of our other core institutions have gone through, which has made them a kind of arm of one political party rather than another. But institutions at their moments of greatest strength in, say, the first half of the 20th century were fundamentally civic institutions. They were not only formative, they provided services and met needs at the local level, at the interpersonal level, in a way that enabled people not only to have more of a voice at the table in corporate America, which they did, and that's important too, but also to have some community, to build some dignity, to have needs met and address some practical necessities. We're pretty far now from thinking of organized labor in that way in most people's experience in America. But I do think that there are ways of thinking about how to recapture some of that and build professional organizations, labor organizations, ways of helping workers understand themselves through the dignity of their work and through the community that's made possible by their work. It would almost take starting over. I mean, I think it would be very hard to get back from what unions have become in America for the most part. But I think it's worth that starting over, and that it would not only meet some economic needs, but also meet some of our civic needs that are really going unmet in a lot of communities in America.
I think this is a place perhaps where we could have a conversation about the top down enabling the bottom up. At the time, those unions were much more robust and filling that greater civic role. For much of that time, there was a federal government that was more supportive of workers organizing and of those labor unions than is currently the case. And so one question about the ability to have institutions in civic life that form that role is to what extent is there a political climate?
I think that's true in some places, but the federal government is still pretty supportive of unionization. There's certainly some states that make it very, very difficult now to unionize, in the South in particular. But I would say that what happened to unions really happened before that, and was a function of a larger decline of cohesion that was evident throughout American life from the 1960s until the end of the 20th century. You can think of the first half of the 20th century in America as a time of increasing social cohesion, when everything in American life told everybody to be more like everybody else. And that was true culturally and economically and politically through the two world wars and the Depression. In the second half of the 20th century, essentially all those same forces, everything in American life told everybody in America to be more like yourself and not more like everybody else. A liberalization happened that was responsive to a sense that cohesion had gone too far, constriction had gone too far. We needed more diversity, more options, more economic liberalization, but also more social liberalization. And part of the result of that, especially in our economic life, was the decline of unionization, the decline of the underlying worker culture that had made it possible. So I think it's certainly true that there are changes in the legal landscape that have further advanced that. But it seems to me that was happening before, and as a function of a much broader set of social forces that have to be understood together and that explain some of the decline of cohesion that's been such a powerful force in every arena of our common life in America.
I want to, this is not a question from the participants, I'll get back to that in a second, but one thing that I do want to put on the table here is that in talking your book about broadly what the right needs to learn from the left and what the left needs to learn from the right, one of the things that you say that the right needs to learn from the left is to think more, pay more attention to, be more attentive to the realities of race and the way that's played out in the history of the United States. And among the other stories of the union movement in the United States is also a story of a struggle of unions that were once all white unions and then integrating unions. And to what extent, I think many of our decline narratives about cohesion in the United States are can also be read as integration narratives, and that there was cohesion in organizations that excluded African Americans, when African Americans were by law and custom forced to be allowed in. That changes, and then regarding that as a decline becomes much more problematic when it is a decline as a result of the
I think that's absolutely right. It really complicates the story that we like to tell ourselves of the last half century and more on the left and the right, where oftentimes that story is a story of growing liberalization. But the right likes the economic liberalization, less so the cultural, the left is the other way. But that story, there's a tension between cohesion and inclusion. And cohesion often comes at the expense of inclusion and often is advanced in the form of exclusion. We see that in some ways now in attitudes toward immigrants in America, where people try to build a sense of cohesion by focusing on who is excluded. And there's no question that the increased inclusion in American life, the growing openness to diversity and integration had to do with a decline in overall social cohesion. Robert Putnam, the political scientist at Harvard, has done tremendously important work on this. And I think you'd have to say it was worth it. The fact that we're paying a price for it doesn't mean that it shouldn't have happened. And it should have happened. And it's right that it happened. And so now we've got to figure out how to pay the price for it and how to deal with some of the problems it created. You know, that's life.
And it does seem to me that some of the stories that emerge from whatever institutions about their own internal strife are really stories about more voices being present within those institutions and being heard in those institutions, and therefore contesting the existing institutional culture in ways that those institutions will have to figure out how to process and integrate if they are going to move on, again, with a population of people within them.
Yeah, look, it has to be said that the moment that we implicitly think about as a kind of golden age of cohesion in America, say the early 1960s, might well have been the least culturally diverse time in the entire history of the United States, because we put such strict restraints on immigration in the 1920s. By the 60s, the proportion of Americans who were born abroad was extremely low. It was lower than 5% in the 1970 census. It's now almost 20%. There's been a tremendous change on that front, a change that largely has been for the good, but that has also had effects on our sense of the unity of our society that have not all been positive. And, you know, there's always a price to be paid for any kind of social and economic advancement. And it is important to see the problems we have in some important ways are the costs of some of the benefits we have. And that doesn't mean that they're any easier to pay or deal with, but it is helpful to see that oftentimes these are other sides of a coin that, that we should be very glad for.
I want to return now to one of the questions that one of the participants submitted, which is asking about, so really, is there never a time when an institution is so failing that the right thing to do is to go outside it? The question doesn't ask this, but given that they're asking about politicians running as outsiders, the Democratic Party is so fundamentally, you know, in bed with the corporate elite, so unable to meet the challenge of our time, that absolutely the only way to do what needs to be done is to go outside it and to run against it, or that it always have to be seen as self-aggrandizing, platforming oneself without doing the hard work to benefit the community.
Yeah, look, I think it is a matter of degree. And that we are living in a moment now where our problems are much more often problems that result from the excessive weakness of our institutions than from their excessive strength. That does not mean that there are not problems that result from the excessive strength of institutions. I think what we talked about before in the Catholic Church scandal is an example of that. And institutions whose sheer solidity protected a grave injustice from being seen and addressed. That happens a lot. But I think that generally speaking, broadly speaking, in this particular moment in American life, we tend not to see the value of institutions. And so we tend too easily to dismiss what they do for us and too easily to ignore why we need them. And so too easily to value that outsider, that maverick. Very often that outsider maverick in politics is a person who doesn't want to do the work of persuasion, doesn't want to do the work of reform, doesn't want to do the work of coalition building. And so you just stand outside and say this whole thing is screwed up. Well, maybe it is, but the way forward requires building some kind of structure for action. And oftentimes in our politics, that looks like a coalition. That doesn't mean that there aren't times when corruption is such that the only thing to do about it is to step outside it or burn down the institution or whatever it is. Even then, you need to build something in its place. It's not possible for our society to function if it is just a bunch of individuals. It is only possible to improve things by working together through the forms that are made possible by institutions. And so that means that at the very least, if you're saying that this institution is so corrupt, we have to get rid of it, you also have to say what we have to do instead. It's just simply not enough to be the barking dog that barks at the car. At some point, if you catch the car, you have to think about what you're going to do about it. And I think that, frankly, the last 4 years in our politics show us that if you don't think that through and the dog catches the car and just keeps barking, the result of that is not productive for anybody. It's not constructive for anyone. I think the kinds of populist movements that we see on both sides of our politics now are not constructive in that way. They're simply trying to offer opposition, sometimes to things that deserve to be opposed, but without offering constructive alternatives. And that's what we really require now. That's why I think this is a time to build. It's why the book has that name, because it's easy to see this as a time for tearing down, but I think it's especially important to see it as a time to build up.
I hesitate to ask because we have tried to keep ourselves away from it. But as somebody who identifies as a conservative and who writes powerfully in the book about the ways in which those kinds of conservative values have an important role to play in rebuilding the institutions and the healthy civic life and culture in the United States. When you look at the lay of the land in the country right now, do you see a conservative institution, a conservative movement that you think can be the one to work within to make that happen?
Well, yes, but I also see, when I look at that lay of the land, a lot of conservative institutions that have turned themselves fundamentally into anti-institutional forces, into venues for venting and not for building anything constructive. And I certainly think, as I say in the book, plainly and repeatedly, that a right that hates institutions is particularly dangerous for a free society. Conservatives really only do good for our societies when we are defenders of what is good about our institutions. Otherwise, we don't have much to offer. And so it's hard for me to see a right that is anti-institutional as conservative in any meaningful sense. I do think that there are some institutions in the conservative movement, and that there are institutions in the country that are ready to take on that work, and that are ready to help the country see what is good about what we have, about what we've inherited, what we can build on, and how we can build on it. But look, I'm not a fan of where the Republican Party has gone in the last 4 years. I haven't been shy about that. And I think that the reason for that is laid out in this book. I mean, the reason for that is that it has become part of the problem. If we think of the problem as a kind of rabid anti-institutionalism that wants only to burn down and that sees the other party as the country's biggest problem, I think we have to try to be constructive and find ways in which we can work together to address the country's challenges. And obviously, that has not been the way of thinking that's dominated our political life in the last few years. So I think we need a lot of change, but I do think that conservatives have a lot to offer in advancing change like that.
I want to end on a note of optimism. In your chapter, when we spoke about this and planning this talk, I said that I didn't really want to talk about your chapter on colleges and universities. This really is supposed to be more of a talk about American politics. But there are actually a couple of things in your chapter on colleges and universities I would like to talk about. The first is what I thought was the most almost inspiringly, maybe I'll take out the almost, inspiringly humane note in the book, which was that in talking about the campus, I will use a term that I'm not a fan of, but I'll use it because it's a shorthand that we all understand, campus cancel culture, and the ways it plays out, which is such an easy punching bag for people on the right and is so often turned to and punched at. And people on the left have standard defenses or responses, which I don't need to go into right now. But rather than engaging in that sort of easy punching, you attempt to understand what are the moral motivations that are activating those university students who are responding in that way. And even as you clearly disagree with what they're doing and don't think it's the right way to go about it, rather than responding to them as sort of targets for general derision or even criticism, you're trying to understand what is the basis on which they're acting, where they're coming from, which I thought was rare, all too rare, and a really meaningful way to watch somebody try to interact with somebody with whom they disagree. But that wasn't actually what I wanted to say about campus life. What you also say is in your book tour for your last book, visiting liberal arts colleges around the country, professors kept saying to you, oh, in other campuses, nobody can speak freely and everyone's shut down and everyone's afraid. And actually here we have a humane life of the mind and a robust conversation, and we're a little island and we're a place that can happen. And I wonder, I'm not minimizing any of the problems we face. We all experience them, we know them, but I also wonder if there is an extent to which in our local lives and experiences, we are in fact seeing a country that doesn't quite look like the worst of the squawking that's reflected to us on cable TV. And whether there is something to say that to some extent, in some ways, in some places, perhaps already some of that rebuilding is happening or it was never destroyed. And that maybe the disconnect is also between some of the top line institutions of American life that look pretty bad indeed, and what those university professors who were talking to you were saying, which was, but actually here it's okay.
Yeah, it's a great point, and thank you. Also, I think one of the hardest things to accept about politics is that basically everybody means well. Everybody's trying to do good. That's a lesson that I've learned over time, being in Washington now for 20 years or so, working for a president, for a Speaker of the House, for various other politicians. Even when people are doing something that you think is objectively going to do harm, and when it's easy to think of selfish motives they might have or of corrupt motives they might have, it's much more likely that they believe they're doing good. And so it's worth trying to understand why they think that, what that looks like, and what you might learn from it, because maybe they're right. Maybe they are doing good. It's enormously important to think about people we disagree with that way. And secondly, I think you're right that there are a lot of ways in which the picture of our country that is painted for us, whether that's on social media or on cable television, is darker than a lot of people's reality, and that there is room for what I would describe as a sociology of success that isn't just about studying what's gone wrong and broken down, but that can begin by asking, why are things in that school working out? Or why are things in that community looking better than you would expect? And trying to build on that and trying to learn from that and think about what we can do with the fact that everywhere you look, there are people who want to improve their situation and their neighbor's situation. Everywhere you look, there are people who are trying to do better. I think that's true about our country, and it does give me a lot of hope. I'm not an optimist. I think optimism is a kind of passive attitude. It says things are going to get better, but I am hopeful, and hope says things could be better if we work to make them better. And that certainly seems to me to be the case about our country, and that's why it's worth thinking about how.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for a wonderful, incredible conversation. Yuval and Rivka, this has been really enlightening and beautiful. So thank you for spending the time with us. Thank you, everyone who attended. And just as a reminder, we'd love for you to leave your feedback using that scale that is located on the session webpage. And we've just put a link to that in the chat as well. So we look forward to continuing to learn with all of you. We wish everyone well. We wish everyone much health. And thank you both again for joining us.